staff are here tonight, so play multiple roles. So I will introduce the panel here and we'll dive into it. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. Really want it to be an interactive discussion, so please think of questions as we're going through. Our three panelists here tonight are Jonas from Columbia, Tahmineh Dehbozorgi from George Washington University, and Lexi Boccuzzi from University of Pennsylvania. Jonas is a student journalist and commentator at Columbia University. He is the editor-in-chief of the Columbia Sundial, the Ivy League's latest heterodox publication. Jonas writes for the Free Press and is a regular commentator on the national media where he discusses student protests, free speech, and Gen Z political issues. At Columbia, he studies political science and economics and is an active member of the conservative community. I'll just give a shout out. Jonas actually brought copies of his latest publication, so take them on the way out. And the Sundial is also supported by one of our partners, the Fund for American Studies, so we're glad to have Ryan here. Great. Tahmineh Dehbozorgi is a litigation fellow at the Institute for Justice. She is a multilingual journalist and advocate with extensive background in public relations and media. Tahmineh is a regular commentator on national and local news media discussing regulations, election, and foreign policy. She received her Juris Doctorate from George Washington University Law School with specialization in national security and cybersecurity law, and her bachelor's from UCLA, majoring in political science. And Lexi Boccuzzi is a recent graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, now working as a policy analyst at the Manhattan Institute. There, she focuses on higher education and social and cultural issues plaguing Gen Z. Her work frequently appears in City Journal, Real Clear Politics, and National Review. At Penn, she served as president of her College Republicans chapter and founded a heterodox publication called the Pennsylvania Post. This fall, she will be starting as a staff writer at the Washington Free Beacon. Very glad to have all three of you here. Thank you for joining. Why don't we give a round of applause to our panel, huh? So you can tell just from those bios, all three of them have really made a name for themselves from the reporting that they've done over the last school year. So, we have three campus reporters, two of which are graduated, one still in school, that have really kind of been following what happened on college campuses on their campus after the horrific attack in Israel on October 7th. And so I'd like to start by going down the line, just to kind of give a picture of what happened at their school, what they saw, what the chatter is on campus, not just in the past, but also in the future, like especially since school is starting at universities across America this week and next week. What should we be expecting for kind of the future of protests across America? So I'll start with Jonas.
So I guess I would start off by first acknowledging that Columbia obviously was the epicenter of sort of all of this strategy and all of these encampments that we're seeing. And so on April 18th, I believe, in 2024 this year, Columbia had its annual, Columbia Dining had its annual event called Surf and Turf, which is an event where they serve unlimited amounts of lobster tails and steak to the student body. And this was also the date that the NYPD came onto campus to arrest the participants of the first encampment. And so I remember very vividly, my friends and I were walking up the street, Amsterdam Avenue. The Within Our Lifetime protest was coming down the street in the opposite direction, chanting Intifada, chanting all of these things. And I was in the dining hall eating with a lot of other students. And the whole time you could just hear the chants and the protest outside. And just the dichotomy of that moment, I think, represented the core conflict that I think these institutions are dealing with, which is that these are very wealthy institutions, these are very powerful institutions that have been around for a while and have outsized influence in American culture. Yet, at Columbia, it was the epicenter of all of this hatred and this perversion of free speech principles that we're seeing. And so going into the fall semester, what we're seeing and hearing in the media is the organizers of the protest, they've gone to the media, they've said, actually, that before protests were their baseline. They'd have protests every week, every 2 weeks or so. But now, encampment is their new baseline. And Columbia can prepare all at once for this. I've been on campus. They've locked down the gates already. They've instituted swipe access. You need to show your ID. They check your picture and everything. Yet they're still managing to picket at move-in. Upper class move-in is tomorrow. I'm sure there's going to be some amount of picketing there. They're tabling outside all of the gates. So we can already see that things are ramping up. And I've talked to professors as well, and we seem to think that the assessment is that the protests are going to get worse, and they're going to continue to escalate, and we shouldn't expect a hard reset.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. Just to, follow up with what Jonas said, I remember vividly the day where George Washington University was taken over by the protesters. I was walking into my corporations exam very nervous about the test because obviously corporations law is not an easy one. And I remember that as I, went to my exam and I came out, just, spending all morning thinking about the laws of Delaware. The first thing I saw walking out of the exam was a massive Palestinian flag and people chanting, death to Israel and things like that. And for 1 second, I had a very traumatic flashback. So I was born and raised in Iran. I came to America on 4th of July, 2015. So all my life I have witnessed people wearing the same uniform that a lot of these protesters are wearing in the streets of my hometown, Tehran, beating women up for not wearing hijab, or shoving people into vans for, just looking like normal human beings. And I was terrified. I just had like this reaction personally. It's like, oh my God, what is happening on my campus? This is a private school, and I mean, we're within the perimeter of White House security because George Washington University is, within a few blocks of the White House. How did this happen? Our law school is situated where the courtyard is. It's the only green area that I guess exists in any DC school. And there were tents everywhere, and many of them were not students at George Washington University. They were from nearby schools that had come to that area right in front of law school. And they were blocking access to the law school building where all of us had final exams. And just to give you some context, law school exams are very difficult, very stressful. Everybody needs to have some quiet time to study, and all of our exams take like 3 to 6 hours, and they were chanting very loudly and disrupting our examinations. The university, first, the president came up with a statement and condemned the protesters and made it clear that they're not welcome, which I think is very different from the reaction that Columbia University had. But at the same time, they really didn't do anything in terms of stopping that. So we went through all of our final exam period by having our law school doors being blocked with wooden barricades because they wanted to come into the building. So to just give you a picture of what it was, and I think the one highlight of what happened at GW was that they put a coffee around the statue of George Washington, they defaced it, and I thought, that was extremely offensive. I don't think that the founders would ever want to see that their legacy was tarnished by a bunch of terrorist supporters, and I don't use that word lightly because, obviously people might have opinions, but at the same time, I want to assure you that people were not there chanting for peace. They were not there to support innocent people not dying war. The rhetoric that they were using was anti-Semitic, was pro-violence, and it was not at all for peace or anything like that. So, but George Washington University towards the end ended up being also the epicenter of the protests, at least in the Washington, D.C. area, where we had a lot of students from campuses come in, and it continued towards the end of graduation.
Hi, thank you for coming. I suppose I don't want to focus on the encampments at Penn because I think the encampment focus will be, better spread out between you two. But I think the viral hearing is probably the sort of beginning of the story at Penn, but I would go even further. I think the beginning of the story at Penn is October 8th. So the day after everything happened in October 7th, the horrific terrorist attacks, there were sort of the beginnings, the inklings of protests, and then throughout that week that followed, there were already public support among Penn students and within the Philadelphia community. Obviously, this is a community that frequently mobilizes a lot of activism, which I think is an important distinction too. And they were already sort of like guns a-blazing within the streets, sort of supporting what had happened on October 7th. And the focus that I kind of want to push on all of this is my concern about the institutional problem. So I think it's one thing to focus on sort of outside actors coming in and agitating, or this proliferation of these encampments, but I think the reality of the situation is these institutions have very, very serious flaws that have basically been modeled in every other institution that exists on their campuses, including the campus publications, including the various clubs and activities on campus. And I think the hearings, and particularly the Ed and Workforce hearing, where Liz McGill and Claudine Gay were sort of caught red-handed, so to speak, with their vacuous lack of morals regarding, or not theirs rather, but their institution's vacuous lack of morals regarding free speech principles, really came to the forefront. So the picture that I think best puts this problem in perspective is two things. One, that weekend that had followed, there were obviously protests that walked through Penn's campus, shouting, in support of the Intifada, shouting from the river to the sea, and Penn's Intro to American Political Thought professor, her name is Ann Norton, tweeted in support of the attack on October 7th. So if that doesn't give you the best indication of sort of the death of Western values and American principles on these schools, the fact that the person who is, who was instructed with teaching Intro to American Political Thought is tweeting this, I think should be indicative enough. Not that she's not entitled to her positions, which she is, but I do think that her brazenness in sort of doing so quite so rapidly, I believe it was October 8th or October 9th that she tweeted this, was really indicative of that. The second thing I would say is, at the time, this was pre-Pennsylvania Post, I was working at the Daily Pennsylvanian. I was an opinion columnist, and I had actually been an editor for a period of time. I wasn't in that particular moment. And the coverage of the protests, which were happening on campus the weekend after October 7th, so before any Israeli response, which I think is a key distinction as well, led by Penn students in conjunction with the Philly Palestinian activist groups, were chanting all of these things that were not coming up in the Daily Pennsylvanian's reports. So the chant from the river to the sea, now it's all colloquial, we all know about it, we'd all recognize it, didn't come up in this reporting. So faculty had actually reached out to me saying, knowing that I was sort of a heterodox thinker that was at the paper that they could trust, these are liberal faculty, not conservative faculty, key distinction there as well, saying, I got videos, why isn't this in the reporting? And I called editors who didn't pick up their phones, didn't listen to my text messages, finally got the president of the paper on the phone, and he tells me, well, we didn't know that was significant. You don't know that's significant? You go to the University of Pennsylvania and you don't know that this chant, which is in the Hamas covenant, there's a key distinction there where they explain what this means, and it means the extermination of Jews from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is not crucial? Of course it's crucial, right? And so that was kind of the beginning of the end of my trust in the institution where I was currently writing. But I say all of this to point out that when Liz McGill goes up there and she represents the University of Pennsylvania in front of the Ed and Workforce Committee and gets drilled by Elise Stefanik and can't come up with an answer, it's not because Liz McGill is an ideological actor. Maybe she is, maybe she isn't, I don't really care. It's because she obviously did not know what values her institution stood for. Because when you are put to the test in a tough situation during a tough time, and you work for an institution, because we've all been there, we've all worked for or represented an institution, or represented our families and knew what our key values were, you can spit them out like this. There's none of that indignation, there's none of that confusion, and that was evident that day. There's a moral relativism which is pervading all of these institutions. And the people that worked at the Daily Pennsylvanian that were doing this misreporting continuously through the time of the encampments now have jobs at the New York Times and Politico. So you're wondering why you're also seeing this faulty reporting at a lot of these mainstream media networks. It's because they're all coming from the same places. So I see this as an institutional problem.
So I think a lot of Americans saw the protests happening as like very well organized, at least relative to, the Occupy movement 13 years ago, or even, the Summer of Love, 2020. So, my question is, are there institutional actors behind this? And to what degree are students actually sympathetic in participating?
I think there's a couple layers of institutional actors going on when we're talking about campus protests. So at Columbia, there's some recent reporting that came out, I believe it was in the Washington Free Beacon, where faculty were revealed to have participated in, so they were faculty at the encampment that were wearing orange vests that were supposedly there for the purpose of de-escalation. But in effect, de-escalation meant preventing people with Israeli flags, Jewish students who wanted to enter a publicly accessible lawn for all Columbia students. They were preventing them from entering. So we knew that this was happening, but then they go to the University Senate, these faculty, they serve on the University Senate, and they say, no, we weren't at the encampment, and then these videos surface of them at the encampment blocking Jewish students from going in. And the second part of this is that they apparently say now that they were instructed actually by the university to go and de-escalate the situation and block Jewish students from entering. And so it's very clear that the social sciences and humanities faculty at Columbia and many of these schools support what the protesters are chanting for and support the method of protest as well. And they've stood against the administration every time that they've tried to call in the NYPD or restrict protest or enforce time, place, and manner rules with regards to protest. So I think it's astonishing. There was a chart from November where people went through the entire list of signatories to two competing letters. One saying, we support the protesters, we condemn a crackdown on supposedly free speech. And there was another letter saying, actually, no, we condemn anti-Semitism, you need to protest in the right place. And they looked at the faculty who signed these letters, and they said, okay, what department are they in? And overwhelmingly, it was revealed that for STEM, it was overwhelmingly they signed the protest, or the letter that condemned the protesters. And for social sciences and humanities, it was the opposite. So I think absolutely we have an institutional issue there. I was up all night during the occupation of Hamilton Hall, and many of the same professors were also out there wearing orange vests, supposedly monitoring the situation, where in effect these were the same people that were supporting the protesters. And so the faculty are a huge institutional issue at these schools. But not only the faculty, especially in New York City, there are outside actors who are coming in. One particular group within our lifetime, they've been very, very prolific in organizing citywide days of rage, they call them, in New York City. You may have seen them if you live here. Especially in the West Village on July 4th, I was there, storming through the streets, shouting at people dining in restaurants, shouting at people walking down the street that they're supporting genocide. And these are the same people that are sneaking people through the gates at Columbia, sending money to protesters at Columbia. And so they're not the only ones. There's lots and lots of outside groups coordinating with the various organizations that are organizing these things at Columbia. And so it's a very, very deep issue.
So at George Washington University, the problem was even worse than just the institution. I would say the institution was helpless at that point. It was more of a political issue. George Washington University security is handled by the DC Police Department. And although the university had begged the city to enforce law on campus and evacuate these protesters who were blocking the students, Mayor Muriel Bowser is just like, I'm not doing anything about this. So it just shows you beyond just the institution, we have a higher level of political inaction. And you go even a layer above that. We saw the Biden administration sending mixed messages and kind of playing both sides, being very ambiguous and not supporting Jewish students, and at the same time, also not being able to take a hard line on anything. So that mixed messages coming from the Biden administration, and then we had someone like Muriel Bowser, a Democrat who has just not been enforcing law in Washington D.C., kind of coupled together. We ended up with a situation at George Washington University, an urban campus that depends on the city for its security. Our students depend on that security and not being able to, access their classroom. And at the same time, we had members of Congress coming to our campus and visiting, members of the oversight committee. I gave them a tour personally, throughout the encampment. And they threatened Muriel Bowser they scheduled a hearing to bring her in front of Congress and question her, what is going on with this? And it was then that the city finally, literally 4 a.m. the night before the hearing was scheduled in front of the House Oversight Committee, that Muriel Bowser dispatched all the police department to George Washington University, and they cleared all the encampments. And the question is, should it take this far for the city to enforce its laws? These students, a lot of them were not even students at George Washington University. There were students coming from Georgetown, from Gallaudet University, from nearby camp, from Baltimore, that just, we're here putting encampment on our campus. This is a private school. This is not a public school like UCLA where they could make the argument that there's a First Amendment issue. No, that did not exist. It was just a pure issue of lack of law enforcement on campus, which also goes into the question of a lot of the cities, including New York City and also Washington, D.C., the police is just not enforcing law anymore. And we see the consequences of that happening with these protests where they trespass. We saw a lot of assaults on many Jewish students. They were scared to go into these classes. No Jewish students or any students should feel scared for their well-being in a school named after George Washington, who famously stood for the rights of Jewish people in America, day one. So I think there is an irony there.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that you're talking to 3 people who lived in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and New York City in the last year. That there's no coincidence in the sort of role of police in this. There's no coincidence in the role of outside actors. I think that was a sort of a universal problem. And obviously the protests were significantly worse at schools that sort of had this problem. We also had a similar problem, which after 14 days, when Penn finally asked the Philadelphia Police Department to do something, despite the fact that they have a private police force that could have done their own thing. They didn't want to be accountable for it because it's student tuition that pays for the Penn police. Philadelphia police refused to get involved, which, you can agree to disagree because maybe they should have used our private police force that we pay for to do that, but 6 or 1. My bigger concern here, I might touch on something different because Casey, you also asked about student support for this and sort of what was the role of student support, so I'll touch on something that didn't really come up. I wrote a piece earlier this summer in City Journal about how I sort of didn't like the comparisons being made between 1968 and today, in particular with the copycat occupation of Hamilton Hall that Jonas was in the middle of, and I was texting him please stay safe. Why am I seeing these videos come out? But I think that the key distinction there is actually, whereas in 1968 the Ivies or rather elite universities, and elite expensive, keyword expensive too, universities were primarily being attended by people who were white and very wealthy, and in the case of the Vietnam War that was being protested, people who were avoiding the draft by going to college. So a lot of those people actually didn't know anyone who was serving in Vietnam, or they had avoided it themselves, so it wasn't a personal issue. The protests actually very successfully increased young people's awareness about the problem and sort of how drastic things were in Vietnam. And so they played whatever your take is on the Vietnam War politically, it doesn't really matter. When you measure protests for effectiveness, we're really good at that. The difference between that and today is the Ivy League is significantly more diverse, both socially and and economically than it was. And I can't speak to GW because I don't know the stats off the top of my head. But if you look at the number of Pell Grant recipients between 1968 and today, so Pell Grant is like the way that the federal government helps subsidize students who are attending school who are low income, and it's almost entirely subsidized by the federal government. This has gone up like astronomically, dramatically gone up. And so, ironically, the diversity in many ways that the left has actually been calling for made this, like these leftist protests a lot less popular. So most of the people, I knew a lot of the people that were running the encampment on campus. I notably, despite being CR's president, tried to be, I had a lot of friends on all over the political spectrum on campus. They were primarily white, primarily Jewish actually, primarily very, very progressive, and had attended very progressive elite New York City private schools where they've been pushing this stuff since they were young. And they also were like proudly like self-flagellating Jews is like a key distinction I'm going to use there too. And there's like a moment I can think of where I was talking to a friend of mine who was out there, and you know, I like went to I was like, what's going on, whatever, and he's like, am I off the record? I'm like, yeah, you're off the record, I'm not quoting you, like whatever, and I won't say his name, so I guess he's kind of on background, I suppose. But he was a friend of mine, I knew him pretty well, he's Jewish, grew up in sort of one of these really wealthy private schools, I think in the Philly area, actually, not in New York. But they had recently just spray painted Zios Get Fucked, I don't want to curse, but on our Ben Franklin statue, which is like the key statue on campus. So for anyone who doesn't know, Zios is actually a term that was coined by David Duke, who was the former Grand Wizard of the KKK, to target Jews, who were also obviously a target of white supremacy in the United States. Okay. So this gets spray painted very quickly. They're trying to cover it up, whatever, because they know that we can use the vandalism to shut down the protests, whatever. And I go and talk to my friend. I'm like, you know, you're Jewish. Like, aren't you concerned about the fact that this sort of rhetoric is getting brought into our campus, and like that you're inviting this type of hate, really, to use the language that he often would use of me about different things. First, he said, you're a Republican. You know what it's like to align yourself with people you don't always agree with, which I sort of laughed at. And I thought was an unfair, synonym there. But secondly, he said, well, I don't really care because we're bringing awareness. And the reality is like, if we have to, we can argue with them on the ground here, and if we have to, in order to bring some awareness, we have to welcome in some of this rhetoric, then like, so be it. And to me, to use a word that the left often uses, it exuded so much privilege. To think about someone who had grown up in primarily a Jewish community. He had probably never been targeted in his life over anti-Semitism. He's not visibly Jewish, so he's a Reform Jew. He doesn't wear a kippah like many of my friends did on campus. And to him, he didn't really care, because it was all about like showing that he was performatively like peacekeeping and anti-Zionist and cared about these people. And it was all about like, he thought it was about bringing awareness. But as I responded to him quickly, and the stats, there was a great piece in the Washington Monthly a while back that I used in my piece when I wrote about this, the campus support for these protests was very low. Even among these elite schools. And it broke down by socioeconomic status. So the wealthier you were, the more you appreciated the protests, and the less wealthy you were, so aka you couldn't afford to skip class or get blocked out of your exams, because if you fail, you might not get a good job.
Or your law degree.
Or your law degree, right? Then you were less supportive of them. And so it was deeply ironic to me that these people thought they were bringing awareness, and in doing so, because it was very much about themselves and their own identity and whatever, that they actually like sacrificed the awareness in a lot of ways. Like, I know a lot of people that started after October 7th and were like, yeah, let's not talk about Israel. Like, I'm very sympathetic to the concerns of the Palestinian people, and then became significantly more politically radicalized in the other direction because of the stuff they were seeing on campus. I mean, this stuff was really egregious. They were screaming, Israelis are pigs, pigs are haram, we don't eat pigs. I mean, the number of things that were being said on our campus that I wouldn't even repeat in this setting are absurd. You can find them on my Twitter. But I think that's the thing that was most striking to me, is that the student support actually wasn't very widespread, and it's really crucial to talk about who was actually advocating for this, because it wasn't primarily Muslim or Arab students that I knew, because most of them were like, well, obviously, why am I going to defend these people? Hamas has been terrorizing our own people for generations, and/or there's all this other complexity that we're having this discourse about. But it was primarily actually driven by very wealthy, progressive students, many of whom were anti-Zionist Jews.
just want to add some real quick thing. Seconding what Lexi said, also at GW, which has a very big Muslim community, I would say majority of the protesters were either second generation Arab Muslim students or just purely white. Many of them were members of the LGBTQ community. And most of them were female. I'm part of the GW choir, so I knew many of them that were like members of the LGBT community as undergrads, female, white, grew up in very wealthy areas. And they were the ones who were really, the ones that were actually visibly involved from GW, representing GW, let alone, there were a lot of students that I didn't know because they were not from GW. But I realized that the major rage that was coming from the conservative side was against international students. It was like, oh, we should revoke their visas or whatever. Like, that's not the demographic that was active. It's those like privileged students. I talked to them like, I actually grew up under radical, tyrannical Islamic regime. Do you know how it's like, do you know what they do to gay people there? And they would just like stare at me. They're like, you are a sellout. I'm like, look at me. I grew up watching like the government killing women in the street because they showed their hair. If you dress like that in my hometown, like the government that you're advocating for, Hamas, which is supported by the government I grew up under, if you look like that in my country, oh my God, I don't want to tell you what's going to happen to you, girl. And, they did not want to hear that because it was so far removed from like what they actually experienced growing up in, privilege, as Lexi said, which is so disheartening. And they go to universities and they also hear all these anti-American hatred for classical liberal values that, I personally came here for. It's like America's the worst country. America is, deserves to be hated. We destroyed the world. Everything's America's fault. And it kind of perpetuates them. A lot of them are useful idiots. They're not bad. I don't think they're just bad students or like, they don't have bad intentions, but they actually did get brainwashed. A lot of them by the institution, which also fed into their background, just being ignorant. And it's very unfortunate because I can tell you the support does come from foreign governments, including Islamic Republic, which, by the way, I was watching the state media in Iran and they were bragging about these Palestinian protests. Like, we did this, we can do this, and we'll continue to do this. And like, this is a huge national security concern. It's just beyond a cultural issue. It's a national security problem. And unfortunately, the Biden administration is not doing anything about it.
I'll just add that this phenomenon with the luxury beliefs that we're talking about at GW and in Philly, same exact thing at Columbia. If you want to, have a good laugh, you should go on to the Columbia University Apartheid Divest Substack, which is a borderline satire column at this point. They had their most recent essay, I believe. There's a quote in there saying, "We are Westerners fighting for the eradication of Western civilization." It is really quite something, and so it's become this just anti-U.S., anti-West, anti-everything that gave you what is good in your life sort of movement. And I think that makes sort of the difference between what I saw at Columbia and what Lexi stated in terms of the lack of support among students for some of the protests very astonishing. Because at Columbia, the polling at Columbia, there is a collaboration between the Columbia Daily Spectator and New York Magazine. They did a pretty widespread poll, several hundred students, and it found that majorities of students disapproved of police action on campus. Majorities of students were sympathetic to the goals of the protesters. There wasn't this widespread backlash of, all of a sudden, because they're setting up encampments, I don't really support the cause as much anymore. There was some of that, but there was way more, I don't like the NYPD, so I'm going to support the people that are protesting the NYPD. I don't like the administration. I don't like the core curriculum, which is, dead white men in their words, right? So I'm going to support the people that are protesting against that. And in addition, we had a BDS referendum, boycott, divest, sanction. And this was passed by the student government in terms of approving it for a general referendum. And we had about 40% voter participation in Columbia College, which is the major undergraduate body. And it passed with about 2/3 support. And, there are some issues with it because there was some people that were boycotting it. There were some people that obviously didn't vote. But I would say among the politically conscious and politically active people at Columbia, I would guess that a strong majority support BDS and support the protesters' causes. And so I think the fact that they would then align themselves with this kind of anti-Western, anti-US sentiment is even more alarming.
Casey, to the point that one of the part of the question was, and except for what he said just now, what is the level of support that we really address among the rank and file, among all the students in the school?
Yeah.
Well, that's
what
what I was
level
just-
of support is there?
That is a good question. Or maybe we can just like quantify it really quickly. Like what percentage of students would you say are sympathetic? Just to like go down the line.
Sympathetic meaning, I think, I guess sympathetic meaning supporting the causes and supporting the tactics. I would say probably at most 60% of all of the undergraduates at Columbia, taking into account people that the silent majority and the people that don't really care and are just trying to study in the library.
So speaking from law school perspective, I would say maybe like 10 to 20% were sympathetic. None of them were involved, and I know this for a fact. I saw 0 law students being involved. But undergrad, I would say at least 50% of the undergraduates. GW is a very political school, and majority of students actually do study social sciences there. We do not have like as much as like diversity of majors as maybe like Columbia. So I would say at least 50% of the student body, majority of them female, were like visibly supportive.
Yeah, so this is what I was getting at earlier. And maybe Penn is sort of a unique phenomenon because we have, our school is set up very differently than GW and Columbia. So we have an engineering school, a nursing school, a college of arts and sciences, which is like your traditional sort of like liberal arts and social sciences and STEM. And then we have the engineering school. So I would say there's like a good, the Wharton School is the business school, yeah. So in my opinion, the school is sort of politically apathetic, which was why there was like this outrage. Like the most donor lashback was at Penn by far. I mean, you have Mark Rowan, you have Cliff Asness, you have John Huntsman, you have these people who are like the biggest names on Wall Street coming out and being like making political statements, which is unheard of. Like I don't think people realize like how bad a lot of this was. And then those were just the people who are willing to sign their names to things. The things that were happening behind the scenes were, it was even worse. I mean, the reason why I can tell you, because I have it on fairly good authority, that the school was paying like an egregious amount of money for a PR firm and has been continuously, that obviously isn't doing that well because, the name is still, in the tanks over this. So Penn may be sort of a unique phenomenon, but I think it was probably around 20% of people were maybe like broadly sympathetic to the cause. But even when you saw the encampment was actually quite large, but there weren't that many people that were like coming to the rallies. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I at least from my understanding, I saw a lot of people who were very politically apathetic become sort of concerned about the institutional bias that was allowing this to kind of persist continuously. So it's not that they became like radical like Zionists or something, or they hated these leftists now and they're like now proud, movement conservatives. But they certainly were concerned about the like institutional support for this, because Penn just like wasn't doing anything for a very extended period of time, both through the fall all the way up through the spring. So I think it was closer to like 20% at Penn. But again, we have all of the Wharton kids and the engineers who don't care about this at all. So,
So I'm kind of curious, now that we've kind of established the what, some of the institutional actors, to what degree students are sympathetic and whatnot, let's zoom in on the student protesters who are all in activists. What is motivating them? From a philosophical standpoint, is it really just years of brainwashing at public schools or elsewhere? Is it just kind of nihilism, loss of faith in the American project? How would you describe them politically, especially in relation to Palestine, which is their new, cause and whatnot? Even how knowledgeable or ignorant are they with that, and why, the history of Palestine, Hamas, et cetera? And to what degree are they, What motivates them to attach so much of their identity to a cause so far away?
So I'm gonna do my best to give as quick of a summary as I can of like my grand bird's eye theory of how all of this happens. So picture this, we have Gen Z in college right now. This is a generation that grew up around the internet, that grew up around social media. And I think that Jonathan Haidt's research is very, very good on this in telling us what exactly happens when you deprive people of social interaction and you replace it with social media. When you have parents that are increasingly helicopter parents that aren't letting their kids take risks, that are preventing them from any sort of emotional harm, because all of a sudden emotional harm is the same as physical harm was the new trend in parenting. You know, they grow up, they go to school, they get their smartphones around the end of elementary school, middle school. It's around the time these social justice movements start to spring up. A lot of these people are also coming politically of age. That's when Me Too is happening. Trump was elected, I believe, in my 7th or 8th grade year. And so you have all of this inundation of information. It's all on social media. And a lot of these people, they're going through puberty as well. So it's a lot of emotional turmoil. And so what happens when you have a social void in your soul or your mind or whatever is that it gets then filled with social justice nonsense. And so then in high school, obviously, these people continue down this path. And that's when BLM is resurfacing. That's when COVID hits. And so, especially towards the end of high school, these people are doing Zoom school. They're spending inordinate amounts of time on social media. And the last 5-6 years of their life, they've just been inundated with all of this social justice, infographic, bite-sized information, you know, the now this newses of the internet. And so we shouldn't be surprised that in college they're predisposed to not like America. They're predisposed to be extra critical of the West, of capitalism. And so I think now we're kind of seeing, for the first time in Gen Z, a cause that unites everyone in such a powerful way. You know, there was this infographic over the summer that I saw on Instagram, and it was one of those like Venn diagram things that like Kamala Harris really likes to talk about, where there's like 5 different circles. And it was like Palestine is in the middle. Palestine is the cause that unites all of them. And around the edges, it was like patriarchy, it was colonialism, imperialism, environmental justice. There was like a flag of Australia in there in terms of the imperial. It was really confusing. And I was like, how does patriarchy connect to Palestine? And so I posted this on Twitter, and I was like, can someone please explain? It was obviously a rhetorical question. I was like, can somebody explain to me how this works? And to my surprise, people actually responded and told me how exactly it connects. And the amount of mental gymnastics that were going on, I think, is very revealing of just how deep a lot of these people are in this ideology. And it is moral relativism, as Lexi said. And so I think the last point of that is that focusing in on the social aspect of it, these people, they don't know how to socialize. They get to college, it's their first year in school after COVID, and they're all posting on social media. I have no friends. We have the Columbia internal sort of social media that people can post anonymously on. It's all, I'm failing my classes. I don't know how to handle my professors are so mean to me. I don't have friends. Really depressing stuff. And so they don't really have a good time in college. And so along comes this movement that aligns with them politically, it clicks with them, and there's a sense of community. And there's a physical space too. There's an encampment, and there's free food. They're all inviting, they all call each other, you know, comrade, brother, sister, whatever. I'm not making this stuff up. This actually happens. And so this draws in all these people, and it provides a real social home. And one of the most enlightening posts I saw was from somebody that I knew was going through a lot of mental health issues, a lot of social issues. And they posted on their story, this is the first time I felt like I've had a sense of community at Columbia. And it was very astonishing to read. And I think that was very indicative of the sense of community that the encampment represented.
Yeah, I 100% agree with everything. I think there are multiple theories on this, and I already touched on some of that regarding like just ignorance and lack of education. Actually, two of fantastic Young Voices contributors wrote an op-ed, and they identified another theory, which I thought was a really interesting one. Rachel Chu and Jill Jacobson wrote this op-ed in New York Post, and they argued that because we see this, I mean, it's on very specific campuses. Like, this is not happening in, you know, like University of Cumberland's or UT Austin, to like at least to some degree it did, but like not as bad. Or like some other campuses. It's happening on very specific schools, Ivy League, wealthy, you know, coming from specific backgrounds. Maybe the question lies in the admission of certain students. I mean, we write all these personal statements. We talk about, you know, what we believe and what we like, and I mean, there is an argument to be made that maybe some of these schools actually prefer activist-minded students that lean a certain direction even before they come to university. I mean, with Dissident Project, I tour around high schools and I talk about my experience living in Iran, and a lot of times I get really amazing questions from high schoolers. I know that they're thinking about these issues, so I don't think it's like a high school issue across the country, or maybe like, it is definitely a parenting issue, but I think that there is another factor here where many of these campuses handpick students that are already predisposed to being very activist-minded, especially leaning left, and as Jonas said, many of them do lack a sense of community. I mean, I'm going to date myself here. I mean, I went to undergrad a million years ago, and I was at UCLA. It was really difficult to get involved in anything. It's a huge school, and if you're not a frat bro or sorority girl and you're not into partying, I mean, there's really not much you can do. So maybe like that's the void that they're trying to fill in, and obviously added with admitting all these students that are like super politically charged and very like activist minded, they're there to make trouble. That's how you get, you know, the situation at GW. I think GW is particularly notorious for preparing politically minded students because it's a DC school. It just naturally attracts the type of people. And obviously where there's a trigger, I mean, you get what you get.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is the Gen Z has a lot of issues. And I think that these are all sort of complementary to one another. Jonas's point in particular, I think, touches on a lot of other, the activism isn't the only problem that Gen Z is having, right? Like, you're seeing seriously declining birth rate. Our generation is reporting at the highest levels that they don't want to have children. They are not interested in getting married. They are depressed. They are lonely. They are alienated. They are politically partisan. Name something bad, and Gen Z is experiencing it. I guess our literacy rates are like not that bad, but the Gen Alphas are in the trenches. So, you know, whatever. It can't get much worse than that, right? The kids coming after us. I am also sympathetic to this point about the activists. There's a great scholar at the Manhattan Institute that talks a lot about affirmative action. Her name's Rainey Mukherjee. And her and I were discussing some of this. And some of this is, the framing is also the framing of the questions too. So the questions sort of incentivize activism, particularly for the liberal arts programs, because they're asking you, how did you contribute to your community, explain something and a part of your identity, and how you triumphed over some, you know, jeopardization of your identity. I mean, all of this, it's sources, sort of leftist. But I think there's sort of something else here, and I feel weird mentioning stuff. It's better explained in a piece I wrote actually for Young Voices in May in Real Clear Politics about sort of how I think that actually the Jewish identity and Israel is pretty crucial to this sort of like universal alignment against them. So the one strand I see as being cohesive through feminism, LGBT issues, basically like insert your leftist paradigm, Black Lives Matter, etc., is the notion of victimhood, right? So the entire infrastructure rests on the idea that being a victim is an important part of your identity. You know, there was a new movie that came out recently called It Ends With Us. It was like a woman's chick flick. And there was like all this fighting on the internet because the lead actress was not vocalizing enough that it was about domestic violence, and you know, it, like better, you know, projecting this woman was a victim, whatever. And I mean, say what you want about this movie, I don't really care, it doesn't matter. But the mainstream sort of like social culture among Gen Z, millennials, and Gen Alpha rests on this idea that like if you are a victim in some regard, that is your entire identity. It must be your entire identity. Otherwise, in some way, you are a traitor. You're jeopardizing that. Well, except for if you're a victim of the Islamic Republic, then you know, and that doesn't work anymore. But But I think the thing is, I mean, to be a Jew, especially a practicing Jew, you have upheld traditions for like generations. I mean, think about this. The number of times that the Jewish people have been targeted by every generation in every part of the world with every different kind of violence. Imagine it, it's happened to the Jewish people. So to be a Jew and to carry on those traditions is to embrace survivorship. If Jews focused on victimhood, they wouldn't last very long, in the same way that these leftists, I don't think, would last very long in warfare, right? Because when you make that your narrative, it's just impossible to triumph beyond that. And I think Israel in particular is sort of the like pinnacle of this, right? This is a story of people who were, whatever your opinion is on the politics of the situation, they were forced out of their homeland via a diaspora that came from a Holocaust. And they founded this like extremely tolerant, extremely like politically advanced, extremely technologically advanced, and fairly wealthy actually. They have a pretty good financial sector too. Place in the middle of the Middle East, while everyone around them was trying to kill them. I mean, if that's not antithetical to victimhood, I don't really know what is. And so I think that whether they're conscious of this or not, I think the understanding, and that's sort of this rhetoric about colonialism and whatever, they're trying to project this weird academic jargon onto it. I think implicitly, there is really the understanding that like people who are embracing this, they are embracing tradition, meaning being Israeli or being a practicing, particularly an Orthodox Jew. You're embracing tradition, you're embracing survivorship, you're embracing accountability, ownership, moving forward, sort of all these things that these leftists don't believe in and really threaten the entire paradigm of their movement at every level. So I think that that's crucial, and I don't feel like I've heard that enough from people.
Can I? Yeah, and I just want to touch on the point about admissions, which I think is very, very important. In the September issue of the Sundial, one of our writers wrote about why Columbia needs to take a look at its admissions questions. And so I'm going to summarize the argument here, but definitely read the article for a fuller picture. But Harvard recently announced, as many of you might be aware of, that they're going to add a question saying, how did you disagree with someone, basically, and what did you learn from it? Which I think is a very, very good question. And we don't have anything like that. One of our questions, for instance, goes something like, what are some of your unique life experiences and perspectives that you'll bring to Columbia, and how are they going to shape how you contribute and learn from Columbia's diverse community? And so you can tell that buried in there's the how will you learn from, but the focus is on how your own perspectives and life experiences will contribute to that learning, rather than the other way around, being that you draw from other people's experiences and you learn from other people, that the collective body of knowledge and experience is greater than anything you could personally contribute from your own, intersectionality or whatever. And so I think that our college admissions process has certainly become distorted in a way that the admissions officers are looking for a sob story. They are looking for victimhood. And they're looking for students that can talk about how, it's picture perfect, honestly. It's like, XYZ happened to me, and so now I'm going to go to college and study this and, fight against XYZ. And then 1 year into college, they change their major to like financial economics and then go work for an investment bank. So, but the admissions question is very important. And it should be something that colleges should really look at.
So I have two more questions, but for the sake of time, I'm going to combine them because I want to hear more from the audience. First, just to play devil's advocate, I feel like a civil libertarian maximalist will say, isn't this all just the protest just protected First Amendment speech? Why are you guys whining, especially for people who believe in freedom, right? So I'm interested in your response in that. And then also, particularly for Jonas and Lexi, both of your schools had deans, heads, presidents that resigned as a result of this because of their reaction. Is that something that should be celebrated, again, from kind of like a civil libertarian standpoint, or is that something that is maybe not a win?
I think these are important questions, and on the question of free speech and protected expression, Columbia and I believe both you, Penn, have pledged essentially to follow the First Amendment. So that's a useful point of analysis here. And so I actually support that. I think that the First Amendment should be respected by private institutions to protect academic freedom for everyone. That being said, there's been a lot of talk of, there's a lot of hate speech against Jews at Columbia. There is a lot of harassment, whatever, you name it, and the administration needs to crack down on it. The reality is that almost everything that's being said at the protest at Columbia is protected First Amendment speech. And that is a very important distinction that a lot of people on the pro-Israel side and people that are condemning the protest don't touch on. And so that's been a very big challenge for people that say that they care about free speech, is whether they say that the university should regulate this kind of thing. And I think that my perspective still is that more speech is always the more answer, that as soon as the university starts censoring speech that is supposedly hate speech against Zionists/Jews, that opens up a whole rabbit hole for all sorts of censorship in the future, I think. But absolutely, vague calls for genocide are protected under the First Amendment. FIRE has written a great deal about this on their blog, and I believe that they're correct. It is abhorrent, and it is, hate speech, frankly. But you run into all sorts of issues when the university then tries to regulate that. And I think the problem that Liz McGill and Claudine Gay ran into is that they were very lawyerly. They were saying, Elise Stefanik is like, is calling for the genocide of Jews allowed under your code of conduct? And, the answer is like kind of yes, because First Amendment principles, but they didn't say this is hate speech and we condemn it. And I think that's the problem that they ran into. Now, what we saw was a far cry from First Amendment protected expression. It was way into the realm of conduct. And when you're setting up an encampment and when you're violating university rules about where and when you can protest, that then crosses the line into conduct rather than speech. And so I think it was very, very ironic. I wrote about this for National Review in December, but essentially all of these people used to be anti-free speech. They used to be like, oh, there's hate speech in the conservative community. There's hate speech being promoted by the Republicans. There's hate speech being promoted by so-and-so speaker. And now these are the people crying free speech, saying, oh, you're sending the NYPD in to crack down on our long-standing tradition of setting up an encampment as a form of free expression. It's absolutely ridiculous. And so I think that, my advice to university administrations would be to both double down on free expression, but also along with that comes an obligation to enforce time, place, and manner rules, and to actually call in the police and use authority when necessary to shut down unprotected conduct. And in situations where there is unprotected speech, to also shut that down. You can't have it both ways. You can't say that we support free speech and we're also going to allow all sorts of conduct. That's why we saw what we saw in the spring.
So I agree with everything Jonas said. Good job, you're a lawyer now. So there is a very big distinction between content and conduct under the First Amendment. And First Amendment is absolutely not an absolute protection. Even a content-based restriction is scrutinized under strict scrutiny. And in some instances, especially where the government has a compelling interest under national security issues, the government can actually restrict that speech. So First Amendment has many, many lines and layers. And what we witnessed, at least I speak about GW, which is a private institution, and they had already given notice that the protests where disruptive conduct was particularly disruptive of law school exams. And that's the type of speech that is actually not protected under the First Amendment. Yes, obviously they can say a lot of hateful messages and that would be protected, but that's a private institution. Private institution a lot of them do adopt First Amendment standards, but they do not have to abide. It's a very different analysis when we're at a university like UCLA, although their conduct was also disorderly and not protected under the First Amendment. But the content of the speech cannot be restricted by the university, even if it's labeled as hate speech. But that was not the issue at any of these encampments. The issue in all these campuses were the conduct itself, because Many of them were blocking access for not only Jewish students, even non-Jewish students, to their classrooms. They were making the campus unsafe. There were a lot of random people on those campuses lingering around. I mean, like, you could just get robbed by someone. The police was not enforcing any laws. And I think that's where the issue of the First Amendment becomes really tricky, is where you see a threat to someone else's rights and their ability to go by their lives and go to class, that's where First Amendment stops protecting that type of conduct and speech. And the thing is that First Amendment by itself is not like self-executory. These policies have to be challenged in the court, and there should be a judge to say what is like constitutional or not. But what we see on these campuses is that we see that under the guise of the First Amendment, they have subverted exactly the type of thing the First Amendment is supposed to protect, which is the right of individuals to go by their lives without being disrupted by someone else. And that's what the First Amendment is supposed to protect. That was not happening. The other issue under the First Amendment, which made it really, really bad in this instance, was the hypocrisy. I can promise you, if there were like pro-Trump protests or pro-Israel protests on at least GW, and they did the same thing, they would not stand for a second for that. But they were giving these people like special treatment, which was due to the fact that these institutions are sympathetic to the cause, like people higher up. They were scared of like the reaction that would cause. So I think that's another layer of the First Amendment issue.
Yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy point is the key point with the Stefanik performance in the hearing. I will full disclosure, I did work intern on the Ed and Workforce Committee, and I did work for Stefanik, so on a separate occasion, so maybe I should be disclosing my bias here. But actually, a lot of my professors came to me and were like, since when do Republicans want to regulate free speech? Like, they don't care about this. And, I said to them, I was like, I know these people, and they're sincerely committed to it, but at the same time, I sat on the University Committee for Open Expression at Penn. The guideline is actually not the First Amendment. It's in the spirit of the First Amendment. There is a key distinction there. One of the key distinctions being when Penn had the whole saga regarding Leah Thomas, the transgender swimmer on the swim team. There was no events where her specific life circumstances were being addressed that would be allowed to be hosted on campus, because the guidelines prohibit targeting individual students with any kind of speech, which logistically actually kind of makes sense, right? Because you deserve to be able to be a student here and not have people, screaming at you personally and coming after you. I'm sure all of us have had some version of that experience, and it's not an ideal one. So I'm sympathetic to that, but that's actually not in the spirit of the First Amendment. I can have an event where I say that I don't think this person should be swimming on a swim team in the public square, and the government can't censor me. So the issue at hand with Stefanik's question was about the hypocrisy, because at Penn in particular, they've been regulating hate speech and censoring faculty and students for decades. I mean, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, was literally founded because of an incident at Penn in the 90s. So this is not that was accused of being hate speech, but was a guy speaking in another language about two random girls who were dancing below his window. The water buffalo, exactly, the infamous water buffalo incident. So the reality is Penn doesn't have a history of protecting the First Amendment, and I think that's the hypocrisy thing is very important. The second thing I'll say, because no one really talked about the presidents and them resigning, I have the unpopular opinion in these circles that I don't think pushing the presidents out was actually a good thing. The Claudine Gay incident is sort of that's its own animal because of plagiarism. I think tolerating plagiarism in any setting, but in particular an academic setting where novelty is valued and people's work is such an integral part of their lives, is there's nothing that threatens the entire institution more. And the fact that people were going and defending her on the internet, longtime academics, I think is proof enough that these institutions have no values. But anyway. But in the case of Liz McGill and some of the other people, I sort of pushed back a little bit because they're obviously not the problem. I mean, Liz McGill alone. Liz McGill was president from fall of 2022 to spring, or to fall of, kind of fall, December of 2023. Poor woman was there for a year. You think she's accounting personally for decades of a failure to protect free speech or hypocrisy on this issue and the budding anti-Semitism problem and the anti-Western sentiment among college students? No. By getting rid of Liz McGill and then subsequently later pushing out Scott Bach, who was the Board of Trustees chair, all that successfully did was take the heat off the universities. because the poster child, the image of what happened in that hearing that went viral, now went away. So all the alumni no longer had something direct that they could target. Because as anyone who's ever fought for small government knows, it's very hard to target some, elusive, dark bureaucracy, which is basically what these universities are. I mean, the number of, Harvard has something like 90 Title IX officers, which essentially now function as DEI officers. Well, you wonder why the tuition's so expensive. They're paying for these people. But I actually think that it did kind of a disservice. It's basically like Liz McGill was blamed for a decades-long problem. Now you took the heat off the universities, and that's kind of the end. With the caveat, I don't think she was canceled either, because there is that whole civil libertarian argument that, this is because of her beliefs. She was fired because she couldn't do her job. Your job as a university president is to keep donations rolling in. Amy Gutmann was a political actor. I mean, she served as the ambassador to Germany under Biden, for Christ's sakes. But she was really good at securing donations. Everybody loved her. The Republican donors liked her. Everybody liked her. And so if you can't do that, you deserve to be fired like any of us would be fired for not doing our jobs. But that's different than me thinking it's good for the cause or for the movement or for free speech concerns on campus. So that's my distinction. And I think in some ways it pertains to Columbia, although the problem among the administrators was a little bit more public. So some of these smaller deans that are getting moved around because they sent text messages and people got photos over their shoulders of them saying anti-Semitic things is a different animal in and of itself. But I can speak to the Liz McGill incident there.
All right, cool. Well, let's move to audience Q&A. Raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, sir. I'll go to you. Yep.
So you guys have talked a little bit about what the free speech policy should be on campus, but in regard to dealing with extreme ideas on college campuses, what do you think can be done by student groups, professors, or faculty, even admin? What kind of programs or events could be held or policies could be put in place to facilitate the kind of thing that I think universities should be at their best should be promoting, which is an exploration of ideas and a sort of testing and debating of ideas. So when you have these protesters saying these very extreme and oftentimes offensive to many people things, how do we get them to engage with other students who disagree with them or who maybe would agree with them in part but would take a different tact? And what kinds of things can we do in terms of the realm of exploring and debating ideas?
This is a funny question coming from you, Clayton, considering the piece you just wrote for Sundial is titled "Cut Half of Columbia's Administration," which I think is a legitimate solution, right? I do think that these efforts need to be student-led, first and foremost. The Columbia administration has held these things called dialogue across difference and campus conversations, where it's state-sanctioned dialogue on Israel-Palestine, which I don't think anybody wants to go to. None of this works. None of this has mass appeal. None of this is scalable. If we're talking about a culture shift, the culture starts with the students. It impacts the students. It's got to originate from the students. So I think this goes back long-term to the admissions room, but in terms of things that can be done now, one thing the administration can do, in which I'm very supportive, is at Columbia we have a core curriculum. Everyone is required to take a great books course. Essentially, it's a third of the classes you take about in Columbia College. And in addition to that, you also have to do orientation when you arrive as a freshman. And the thing that's missing from all of this is that there is no focus on free expression. There is nothing dedicated to dialogue or free speech or anything like that, or how to have difficult political conversations. You used to be able to have those when you got to college because you grew up being, properly socialized, but now obviously kids aren't anymore. So I think that having some sort of free speech module, some kind of requirement in the core that treats free speech and dialogue of the same importance as the rest of the great books curriculum that you're required to take. I think that will instill in people sort of an institutional level of appreciation for free expression.
That's a very good question, because as Jonas was mentioning great books, something just dawned on me. I think the problem is so much deeper than that. I think people just don't know how to use the languages. English or any other language. Like, it's surprising to me. I came to America, like most of my classmates like do not even like speak any other language. They cannot really engage with like a global perspective to see like how the world is. And I think that's something we need to fix in our education system, is that we need to teach people better how to use English. And we saw that the English itself, the English language has been subverted like a great deal. That, you know, we have political correctness, like we self-censor ourselves, which is another astonishing thing to me as a, you know, foreigner, that wow, like we are very self-aware and we self-censor, even conservatives, even those that are, you know, do not agree with this. Like a lot of times I talk to my friends in law schools, like, why don't you like talk about it? They're like, I don't want to get canceled. Like, I mean, just don't be afraid. But like, I think it's because people, like especially my generation, I mean, older Gen Z, but I guess going back to what Jonas was saying earlier about social media just being the only means of, and I'm not saying social media is a bad thing, I think it has its benefit, but like also not getting exposed to a lot of conflicts in the first place and not being able to utilize the language and like being able to communicate effectively with your opponents and debate, I think that's like a really big issue. I think we need to bolster our English education and then also like teach people more languages.
Yes, I'm gonna have a hot take here. Actually, don't think the problem is free speech. And I say that as someone who I love free speech and I'm super passionate about it. I talk about it all the time. There's a great piece in City Journal, plugging my employer, so I guess this is kind of icky, but 2 days ago, yesterday, by his name's Wilfred McClay. He's a historian. He's at Hillsdale. And the title was "Free Speech is Not Enough." And the substance of the piece, which I thought was one of the best things I've read since everything happened, was basically, and it really summarizes how I was feeling, is basically like, if we live in a democracy with no shared principles and we have free speech, that means what? That means people can yell at each other in the street and we'll let them do that. It doesn't fix the problem, right? So the problem is the lack of empathy. The problem is the intolerance. The problem is the fact that half of these people who are existing on these campuses don't believe that the other half has the ability to disagree with them. So like, you can't live in a pluralistic society where half of the people don't believe in pluralism. And by pluralism, I mean just like different types of ideas should all be welcome. So like, you need to tacitly accept like what we would call like in these circles like lowercase l liberalism. So like, hey, we have the ability to disagree and like that's a good thing. Like you have a right to vote and I have a right to vote, and we're gonna hash it out of the ballot box or in the public square. So when you have a generation of people who, I almost think like classifying them as indoctrination feels like the wrong word too. Like I think the right has been doing, I don't love some of the language around this. It feels very extreme and I don't think it helps actually diagnose what the real problem is. There was a survey that came, there was 2 surveys I read recently about one about K through 12 and one about higher ed. So ACTA, which is the American Council for Trustees and Alumni, put out a survey I think it was like a month ago, assessing the civic literacy, so like understanding of American government and history and all these things among college students and recent college graduates in the United States. And less than 30% of them said that they knew that the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. Less than 30% of recent college graduates and undergraduates in the United States said that they knew what the 13th Amendment did. And that's not that surprising to me, because at Penn, we don't have a designated Civil War historian. I went to school in Philadelphia, and there was no designated Civil War historian. I mean, that's egregious. Like there's no way that you can say that this isn't a problem of education and literacy when you're seeing these numbers. The K through 12 numbers are far, far, far worse. There's a piece in the Harvard Gazette from a couple of days ago that talked about this. And I mean, it was just like, these kids can barely read, so I'm not surprised that they don't know like what the 3 branches of government are by the time they're in 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th grade. But I think you look at that and you say, well, this isn't even a problem of like they're rejecting these principles. This isn't even a problem of like they don't believe that different types of speech should be protected. This is like they don't even know anything about the system they're operating in. And so I think that actually in many ways it is so depressing, but it's also so optimism inducing for me, because like this is a very real problem that can be solved by like mandating civic education at the K through 12 level in every state, right? And then at the higher education level, making alumni, like many of the people who went to Wharton, who I love these people, but they didn't think that liberal and civic education was all that important because they were focusing on pre-professional business education, making them realize like, yeah, your HR departments are a mess at your firms because these people don't know what it means to be an American. Like, are you surprised? This is not the 1980s anymore. And so they've been doing some really good work at a bunch of state schools pushed by Republican state legislators. In the University of Florida, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the University of Texas at Austin, a few of these places in the last 2 to 5 years have put together these really phenomenal civic schools, basically, where they're teaching civic education in a sort of traditional, Oxford-style pre-statesmanship way, but also where they're offering mandated core curriculum classes to talk about this, because most schools don't have a substantive civic requirement, and those that do, you can basically take any woke class that you can find that like says the word American and get it to fulfill it, which is, its own problem. So yeah.
A hot take I very much agree with.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
One of the issues of diversity, I think, is we talked about it a little bit, and the admissions, they're not admitting the diversity of the body, but, talked about Amy Gutman. I view Amy Gutman as the downfall of the University of Pennsylvania, because I'd spoken with her when she was first hired and talked about diversity in the faculty. And she said, I'm committed to make sure that we're going to have a diverse faculty. And 2 minutes after she spoke with me, I'm sure she never thought about it again. But
Yeah.
isn't that the problem? The diversity, and admissions, is there no diversity in the people in the admissions policy among the faculty? And from what I'm reading, even worse, in the administration, which is now larger than the faculty. How do you view those, and are those really the underlying problems without which things are to be fixed? And by the way, one thing that you said about Gail, I agree. People I know that went to Penn weren't sure that she should have left go either. She wouldn't have if she would have said when she was asked, I
Right.
now realize that there are all these problems and I'm going to fix it.
Right.
And she didn't.
I agree.
So,
Yeah, so just to reiterate kind of how much of the problem is diversity with faculty as well as students and administrators. Thoughts?
Do you want to
Yeah.
take this first?
So it's the beauty of like these civic schools that are so freaking cool. And maybe part of me just wishes that these were around when I was going to college or applying to college. So the University of Florida has one that's gotten a lot of PR because it was, helped organized by Ron DeSantis and Ben Sasse, the former senator from Nebraska, who then became president of the University of Florida. It's called the Hamilton Center. So there's a lot of like nuance about how colleges are structured, like hiring structure and tenureship and who's an associate versus a visiting versus a residential. I have learned a lot about this in the last few months where I was researching all of this to try to write about it because I was just a regular student. I didn't know anything about this. I don't know. My parents didn't go to these types of schools. They're not involved in anything like this. I had no idea. But the short story is, it makes a very big difference if when you're running a program at these schools, you have the ability to command like tenure track hiring, right? So the beauty of a lot of these programs, and there's one at ASU, at Arizona State that's been around for a really long time, which is called Scuttle. So it's the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, which is really successful and has been like the model for all of these, along with a different but sort of adjacent program model at Princeton called the James Madison program run by Robbie George. And basically, Robbie's program, Professor George's program is a little bit different because he can't hire tenure track faculty, but all of these programs kind of exist within the broader structure of the university, but they don't have as much oversight from like the dean of a college, for example, who could say like, I'm rejecting this tenureship. That's a pretty common thing that happens. I mean, there are a lot of well-known professors, conservative faculty, who have had to leave these schools because they didn't get tenure track jobs over these types of things. A lot of people don't know about this because the media doesn't cover these issues, because no one really cared about higher ed until like 5 minutes ago. But this has been going on for the last between 20 and 40 years. And I totally agree with you. I mean, they should have known. And this is one of the things that Mark Rowan, who was one of the big donors that pulled out from Penn, said in his letter that the Daily Pennsylvania refused to publish. And thanks to Ryan's help and a few other people who really pushed me over the finish line, I started a new paper over this because that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me. But he talked about this. He said, I've been around this since I graduated, and we've been saying that this was going to be a problem, right? But I think the reality is, until you direct, this is why I don't entirely agree that it has to be student-driven, because I think that at a place like Penn where there's so much apathy, a lot of it has to be alumni-directed so we can get the students to be educated and then be interested. I have a phenomenal liberal professor who teaches, she's an early Americanist, and she's one of my mentors, and I love her dearly. She's the only person who teaches undergraduate classes on early American history. She's one of the best teachers, meaning not professors, but she is a great professor too, a key distinction at teaching in the school. And they're constantly giving her a hard time about, your class sizes can't be bigger, this, that, and the other thing. So many people I knew went in so much more orthodox in whatever their background was. And they learned about American history and their political views were moderated because, shocker, if you teach history well, it's complicated. It's not really, I think the reality of the situation is this is not going to fix itself because you're not going to be able to purge these private schools' administrations. So you need alumni to mobilize together and say, I'm not just funding my little program that's going to help my kid get a job or get into the school, right? I am going to fund a chair in a specific department, or I'm going to endow a chair in this very specific tailored thing. They can only teach this thing. We need alumni to come together and endow a chair in Civil War history in the Penn History Department. Why hasn't that happened? I know the history department chair. I think she would be the head of the department. I think she'd be interested in it. But some of it is just people aren't coming and they're not spending the money and they're not willing to do it. So that's one. The second thing I would say is there's actually a huge, and sorry, I'm going on long, the conservative students are actually very much deprived for this as well. So I had to really go out of my way to seek mentors who were going to help push me in the direction of opportunities that I wanted. And many of them didn't know about the Fund for American Studies or Young Voices or any of this. I had to find this out on my own or through friends or because, people like Ryan and Casey cold reach out to students. If you had conservative or just intellectually diverse faculty at these schools, it would also better help set up students for a lot of different opportunities, and bringing those opportunities to campus would also help to diversify the sort of undergraduate intellectual diversity. Because a lot more people are malleable than you think they are, but I think this is just not going to be fixed in the short term by just hoping and praying that administrators come along, but alumni really need to come together and start pushing and saying until you hire the type of people we want, we're not going to fund your schools anymore.
Cool. Yeah, I just want to do moderator's privilege, putting kind of a point of optimism as someone who's been in the conservative libertarian student space for 10 years. It seems like there's a lot of great groups popping up, not just the ones you mentioned. Also want to give a shout out to the David Network. We have Annie here, representative. It seems like at least there's a lot of energy on the center right for young people, and a lot of donors are waking up too, especially post-pandemic. So hopefully the future will be brighter. I think we'll have time for one more question. I saw it in the back. Yes.
So I've been forced in this race in as much as I published an op-ed last spring, last April or so, arguing in effect that the anti-Israel campus protests have fuck all to do with Israel. That fundamentally, this an internecine power struggle within academia, and anything that's happening with Levant as in terms of a war that's happening there is actually completely irrelevant to what they're protesting. As evidence for that, I use the demands of the Columbia protests were probably preeminent in terms of the protests that were happening at the time, and the demands of the Columbia protests, vanishingly few of them had to do with anything to do with the geopolitics of Levant. The foremost among them was divestment from 3 tech companies, which were Google, Apple, and Microsoft, if I recall correctly, and all of them had very tangential relationships with the Israeli security state, whatever. it was not like a deeply, like basically it seemed like they were grasping at straws to use Israel as a pretense for a power grab from one class of academia to another like demographic kind of like continuing in academia. And I wonder, I guess my question to, I apologize for this long.
No worries at all. Yeah.
What's the word? Verbose question. To what degree do you guys think, you panelists, think that the anti-Israel campus protests, to what degree do you think it has to do with Israel at all? Like, I am very skeptical of the degree to which this is even remotely connected with a conflict in the Levant. But
Yeah, this is actually a really important issue because, as you mentioned, what are the key, I guess, like what's the most powerful thing about America's economy? It's technology. Google, Apple, Microsoft, these technological institutions are the reason why, like, none of our, and not even China and its allies can ever challenge us, because all we need to do is like unplug Google and their entire system is down. But what we've seen in the past few years is we see an increase in cyber attacks to America's infrastructure. At the same time, we see, on the other hand, all these cultural warfare happening at the epicenters of American intellectualism, which is these top universities where the next generations of engineers, lawyers, doctors are going to the workforce, being totally dissuaded from, like we see all these like environmentalist groups like going after every single corporation. Corporations are evil. And I can tell you that the sentiment gets really real. We are losing a lot of talent because of this rhetoric. And we have like actual foreign enemies that are funding these, and it's public. I mean, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Russia, China, they're behind a lot of these groups, and they're very good at what they do. Maybe they do not have the missiles and the nukes to hit us, but they've been around the PR block way longer than the United States has been in existence. Informational warfare is actually the tool that Russia and China and Iran are using against America. And to your point regarding divestment, I mean, what is the best way you can actually weaken America's most powerful economic institutions, which is the tech, is by, going to the centers of the talent and dissuading them from actually being attracted to those industries. And over time, I mean, we see a staggering, this is gonna happen in the very short term as well, like we see like staggering effects of we don't have enough talents going to these sectors anymore, because in universities, they learn that, corporations are evil. And even in the legal world, I mean, we are losing a lot of talent to this rhetoric. A lot of students are dissuaded from pursuing higher education, investing in themselves, because they kind of get stuck in this like hippie, lifestyle. Like, yeah, we just hate America so much, we do not want to like contribute to this economy anymore. And it unfortunately happens. And I think it goes back to the institutional problem where a lot of these students are really not being taught real skills because they're wasting so much time being caught up in unnecessary drama. Is like they're paying a lot of money and they're wasting years of their youth that should be spent on learning skills that's actually eventually going to benefit America's national security interests and our economic interest, but it's not happening. Have a follow-up?
Yeah, I apologize. Tahmineh on the
Oh, wow, there you go.
But no, I feel like the way that you interpret my question kind of grants the premise in a way, in the sense that, like, I'm challenging the idea to which, like, the enmeshment of these tech companies with Israel is at all meaningful, and I think that basically, like, the anti-Israel protesters are grasping at straws, using Israel as a pretense to do a protest, like, for an overturn of power from one sector of academia to another.
Yeah, well, I mean,
interpreting the question suggests that there actually is a meaningful connection between American technology, like tech enterprise, and Israel, and I dispute that premise on the basis that I think that, like, there are sectors of tech that seem to go both ways, but fundamentally, like, the reasons, the ways they're, like, connecting these companies in particular to Israel seem extremely tenuous.
No, I understand what you say, and I mean, as I said earlier, the debate or the protests were never about peace or, you know, the innocent children of Gaza. It was all, as you said, like using Israel as like a straw, but at the same time, there is actually a real connection because Israel is United States ally in the Middle East. I mean, they're hitting two birds with one stone. I mean, they are perpetuating anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, but at the same time, they're targeting America's actual economic sector by like dissuading a lot of talent from being attracted and also like dissuading a lot of funders. I think that does actually create a lot of disruption.
All right, we're going to end it right there. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it. Yeah, give a hand for our panelists. It's Sovereign House, so after every event, we have a little party. Feel free to hang out. We got an open bar. I hope the panelists will stick around for a little bit. If you want to learn more about Young Voices, find me too. Thanks. Have a great night.